news vendor model is this decision tool that I learned way back in operations, and a lot of people know it and use it, but it's always been one of my favorite tools. And essentially all it does is forces you to calculate the cost of underage versus the cost of overage. So what is the cost of having too much capacity when we have uncertain demand? And what is the cost of having not enough capacity when we have uncertain demand? And it's called the news vendor model because the news is only one day and they have to decide how many papers to bring to the corner the day, and recognizing that they will make money on every paper that they sell. They don't want to be under, and recognizing that they eat the cost for a paper at the end of the day because there's no one to sell it to if they bought too many. And this to me could not be more relevant today, because essentially what we're saying is for a period of time, we have to figure out how much demand we're going to get. And then we say quickly, well, we may not be able to figure it out. If we are a restaurant and we're allowed to reopen in the middle of June, I'm not sure that it's easy to predict whether you are going to have 15% of capacity or 40% of capacity used. I think nobody thinks it's going to be 75 or 80 in that case, although other businesses would have that. But there's a big difference between staffing up and buying food for 15% versus staffing up and buying food for 40%. And you have ground to make up. And so there's a temptation to want to go towards the max. But then if you get too much capacity, you're going to lose more money.
What kind of advice or guidance are you giving to clients that are sitting in these three spaces, Mark?
Well, different advice for different depending on the space, but also them. So I wanted to go back to this news vendor model. And again, it's relatively simple, but like a lot of consulting frameworks, they're relatively simple once you present them, but then forcing people to think through them is where they get the value. And so, I want people to be thinking about their capacity. Their capacity isn't necessarily number of widgets. It could be, how much, if you're a restaurant, how much capacity you staff for. If you're a consulting firm like ours, how much demand you keep, although we tend to make our demand bets over a long period of time. But you could argue that we could decide how many of our consultants we want to have on staff for the next year. And essentially, what I think people should do, to the extent they can, is calculate the cost. So, and be very specific. So, in normal times, our business did $2 million a year. It did $170,000 a month. What do we think is the likely scenario that we're going to do per month over the next 7 months? And let's assume that's $50,000. I mean, just a small percentage. Well, how terrible would it be if we actually had demand for $100,000, but only staffed up for 50? Well, the issue is you have a share loss if other people are staffing up and being bolder quicker because they have more cash reserves or a different perspective or different risk tolerance. Or again, if you're shipping goods, you may find that you have cost if you decide that you want to meet it because you never want to stock out, like you mentioned in that Ivy course, then you may actually have costs to get back there. On the other side, if you assume it's going to come back quickly and you staff it for 100 and you only get 50, well, what is going to happen? And how much cash are you going to lose?